Hello and welcome to this video where, amongst other things, you will see how focusing on language techniques and connotations will help you with paper 1. This student is able to make reference to the author in both paragraphs here, beginning with Shelley. They also are able to mention a language technique in both paragraphs immediately, and they're able to focus on one word in particular, in this case the phrase nearly dark, and then they contrast this by going to more depth by suggesting that nearly offers a different interpretation to the initial one, that speaks about how Victor Frankenstein's life has less hope because of the horrible events enacted upon it by their creation. And again, in question 2, they make reference to the reader and how the reader might respond to the language choices being shown. Question 3 here takes a particular approach to the language question that attempts to identify as many internal language features as possible. And as you see in other videos, another approach is to identify a point of change between the beginning and the ending of the extract, and looking at narrative or wider structural choices that perhaps also occur outside of the extract as well. So we're going to look at this in terms of the approach of finding as many internal structures as possible. So the important thing with this is to be as precise as possible. And the precision in this comes really throughout the paragraph. If the reader's made more interested, if they're sympathizing with his rage, how precisely are they going to sympathize with him? There is some useful wider structure referenced here, the foreshadowing of later on in the text. And again, that demonstration of knowledge is very useful in your, well, that can't really exist though in paper 1 for the English language. So we have to take this as it is, and it refers to internal structural techniques. Question 4 is different. Question 4 asks you to evaluate. And to evaluate, that really means that at the start of each of your paragraphs, you need to show a particular idea that you've identified, and then over the course of the rest of that paragraph, you want to show how that idea relates to the question that has been asked through the language and structure techniques that the writer uses. So to be clear, the start of each paragraph, that first sentence, needs to reference an idea or a variable, and then the rest of the paragraph is going to refer to, say, language or structure techniques that back up that idea. Let me show you what I mean. In this paragraph, it says, in this extract, Shelley does make the reader sympathize and feel sorry for Frankenstein, as the scolding tone the monster uses to address him is harsh and hurtful. So the tone the monster uses is harsh and hurtful, and that is the idea in the variable. And this student uses language techniques here to talk about this. We then have an interesting contrast suggesting that Shelley isn't making the reader sympathize for Victor Frankenstein. And this idea of contrast becomes its own implicit evaluation. Again, techniques are being used in here, and the reader is being mentioned specifically. As with before, we're mentioning the author directly, Shelley. It says here, Shelley, however, does make the reader feel sorry for Frankenstein when he lists all his family members who have passed. And the question we then ask ourselves is, can recounting the events in the text count as an idea? And this is a very fine line. And certainly when you are writing an exam response, you might find yourself using a direct recounting of an event as the opening of your evaluative paragraph. It can happen. The difference between an event and idea is that the event is Victor Frankenstein lists his family members who have passed. The idea is that Victor Frankenstein mourns his family members who have passed by listing them. And it's a subtle distinction, but you want to really look at the events of the novel in terms of the ideas of them, or maybe how they impact, rather than just them as what physically happens. And again, we've got reference to the question, got language techniques here. Mentioning what the word type is also going to be helpful. If they are opposed, then it's going to be an adjective. And finally here, we can see some context. And in terms of the English language paper, if you can make some mention of some context, that's going to be useful. I don't imagine that it's entirely expected, but look to your teacher and to some of these other videos for pieces of context that you can mention. Now here I will make some wider mention of Frankenstein. It is useful to be aware of Paradise Lost, one of the key texts referenced in the novel that the creation actually reads to try to understand English, which is highly unlikely, but we have to accept that he does so. And Paradise Lost was written by a very influential politician and writer, Milton. And it's about the fall of Adam and Eve, and it really looks at the role of Satan, the devil in this instance, in a challenging fashion. And it almost looks to see the devil as conflicting with free will and choice, and this is going to preempt the Age of Enlightenment and how Western society looked at reason and its rise in society as being both a powerful yet quite dangerous thing. It led to things like the French Revolution. Now, you don't necessarily need to understand any of that for the English language paper 1, but really to understand Western culture, you need to have some awareness of that and to think about that yourself. Okay, so we can see that the student has redrafted some responses to their pre-test, which is a very good idea. A useful point that the student does is that they look at sentence length and the mindset of the character. In this case, the narrator is the character. Frankenstein is narrating his experiences. And usually a broken or fragmented sentence length indicates a broken or fragmented, disturbed, unsettled narrative mindset. And that's a useful thing to say. So this then leads us on to the actual test itself. And this is at the end of chapter 4. And it's prior to the creation being successful. And the questions are, what do you learn about the scientist? The obsession in the language question. Question 3 is generic. How is the reader interested? And question 4 talks about our admiration for Victor Frankenstein. Some points here that I looked at was to connect imagination with being astonished, the sense of wonder that Victor Frankenstein would have, and this idea of his arrogance or confidence in the middle, okay, and also of interest, his desire to make the creation as a superhuman. That's going to be an interesting and important idea there. Again, notice that these points are really more important for your literature analysis because the text that you'll see for your English language will be an unseen extract.